Hello. We are now going to have a quick review on what are the major points that we want to take away from our reading of Hertz and Malinowski. The first principle is that while Hertz is talking about a series of primitive peoples and their rights and beliefs, that when we look at them, we can imagine, we can distill from what we have read and learned in Hertz about elements in the present day. He draws then from primitive or elementary forms because he believes that these will instruct us in the more complex modern ones. It is not just about the deceased that he's talking about, but also about death in general as a phenomenon and about the collective response to it. The first, or the three basic elements about death that he tells us, is that we see life vanish and we need to give it some meaning. What is the meaning that we give it? The meaning that we give it is that there is something more to life than the body itself. Often that's put in terms of the creation or the existence of some life force, call it the soul, and that life force has to be transformed into something else. It can be transformed by earth, being put into the earth. It can be just transformed by water, being washed, being purified, being dipped in water, being sent on a river, for example. It can be transformed by fire, cremation, burning in some way. And finally, it can be transformed by endocannibalism or eating, taking in the person who is dead. So the occasion of death, then, all that we have learned is that it requires the surviving, those who live, those who have been bereft of the dead, to go through special duties and rituals in which they enter a kind of dismal period that is meant in some senses to recreate or to echo the experience of the dead, who's also entering a very dismal period during the time that he or she is moving from death to the new existence, which will be the new life, the everlasting life. And so the living have to go through some dismal period, some duties and rituals in order to parallel what is happening to the deceased. Just as you, the deceased, have gone through a hard time, I, the bereft, the one who is mourning for you, the one who misses you most, and in general the society will support this, must go through a transformation. And so mourning and sorrow must show itself in a transformation of the kind of things that the living do, the way they appear, the nature of the relationships that they have with others. A second point was that there is a taboo surrounding the body. The dead body is both a source of awe and horror. And that awe is there to make us be sure that we provide it with some sort of respectful leaving. But that horror is to make sure that we do remove it, that we do deal with it, that we don't just walk away from it. We've seen that that period between the death and what follows is marked by a provisional burial, meaning the first stage, and then a secondary burial. We have seen that in our modern times, very often this is done between the funeral, which is the initial disposal of the body, and then some memorial that occurs afterwards, perhaps on the anniversary of the death, perhaps in the end of the mourning. It is literal and symbolic at once, this provisional and secondary burial. meaning it is literal in that we bury someone, dig him up, and then rebury him or rebury the bones. But what we are really doing is we're parting from him first provisionally, temporarily, and then we're parting from him much more permanently after the transformation has occurred. We also saw a third element, excuse me, that both the dead and the bereaved have to be protected by the group. They have to be consoled. They have to be given a respectful accompaniment. Protection can be carried out by a variety of purification ceremonies. Washing the dead is not uncommon. Washing the bereaved is not uncommon. Use of valuables, giving of valuables is not uncommon. Giving of support is not uncommon. And of course, most important, the most important protection that we give both the dead and the bereaved is we keep them company. We don't let them be alone. We don't let the dead go alone to its final rest. We don't let those who are mourning be alone. In both cases, both for the deceased and the bereaved, they are enabled to be recreated, to go to a new life. The dead to a new life in some other realm, and the bereaved to a new life that enables them to continue to go on with life even after they have lost someone that they loved, that was close to them, that was important in their lives. It prevents the centrifugal forces from throwing us out there, and it creates centripetal forces to bring us together. The basic assumption then that is in the Hertz reading is that the mourners are one with the dead and they somehow share the dead's condition. If the mourners don't wash, if the mourners don't take care of themselves, if the mourners look disgusting, then it is because they, like the dead, want to make their body disgusting. And to see if even in their disgusting state, they're not washed, they're not cleaned, they're not easy to be with, that people will still come to console them and be with them. That is the same thing, of course, that the dead person wants to know. So in some ways, they are separate from the community, and in other ways, they are brought into and close to the community. Distance and relation, closeness and putting one away, further away. That is part of the themes that Hertz has raised. When the entire process is completed, when it is all over, this of course brings about a profound change among the living. The mourners are liberated to come back to life. The dead are liberated to go on to everlasting life. The liberation of the mourners means that they can go back to their profane, everyday world from which they were separated during the period of their mourning. For the dead, it means that they are no longer thought of as being weighed down by their dead body, by the trauma of their death. They are now able to, as it were, go to heaven. They're not weighted down. They can rise. Their resting places are often decorated. Relics are brought. Gifts are brought. In a way, this makes them reminded that they have a life. Finally, we saw in Hertz and in Malinowski that the more important that the deceased person is for the group, the more energy and the more collective concern in his death and in its after rituals. Important leaders get bigger funerals, get more people bereaved. Their death, in a sense, unbalances the society and the culture in many ways more than the death of someone who has touched relatively few. But death, and especially death, must always And that's the message. Must always be accompanied by some sort of resurrection, coming back to life. The mourners come back to life, and the dead come back to life. So if we think about resurrection, as you may be familiar with it, for example, in Christianity, that theme of Jesus being resurrected is really not a unique theme, except there they talk about his bodily resurrection, even though, of course, his body was never found. We just assumed that it was resurrected. In a sense, we said of Jesus that he was made like a God. He was a God. He was the Son of God. In a way, that's another example of what we begin with ancestor worship. The ceremonies of transformation, of initiation, rites of passage really mean that we go from one life to another life, from death to life. It's inversion, it's resurrection. Death and resurrection come together. So those are the messages that we learned from Hertz. Those are the ones you want to remember. You want to be aware of some of the specifics in there, but if you recall this, you will have a pretty good reminder of everything that we covered when we read through and discussed Hertz and, to some extent, Malinowski.